Hello, everyone. So thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for using this new web platform for the Goose webinars. Welcome to this presentation, which is part of an ongoing Goose webinar series exploring aspects of global sustained ocean observing. My name is Albert Fisher. I'm the director of the Global Ocean Observing System Program Office, which is headquartered here at the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO in Paris. And for the next hour, we'll start with an approximately 30-minute presentation from Dorothee Bakker and Kim Currie. Dorothee is at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, UK, and Kim is at New Zealand's National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research, or NIWA. And they'll be speaking about Socat, the Surface Ocean CO2 Atlas database. After Dorothee and Kim's presentation, we'll conduct a question and answer session by chat. You can write into the chat window, which you can open up under the chat box, or you can ask your question in the question window. And if you're having real trouble, you can raise your hand. That's the way the new interface works. Feel free to test it out right now, to introduce yourself in the chat window if you want to, just to test it out. So the chat window will be open, the question window will be open during the presentations if you'd like to ask some clarifying questions. The session is being recorded, and the link to the recording will be posted in the Goose webpage as well as on our YouTube channel, where you can find all the old webinars. So right now, Dorothee and Kim, I'm going to hand it over to you for your presentation.
Thanks, Albert. This is Kim Currie in New Zealand. So tēnā koutou katoa, greetings to everyone from New Zealand. I'm going to start the presentation by putting Socat into the bigger Goose picture. And then Dorothee is going to take over and do the majority of the presentation describing Socat in more detail. So Goose, the Global Ocean Observing System. So it's a continuous, integrated and long-term program and framework for ocean observations, using that framework for ocean observing, the FOO, that I think we're probably all familiar with. And as I use it, I'm getting more familiar. But basically, it's a framework that takes us from the issues, the science-driven requirements that stem from societal needs and issues, through to the observation, the design and implementation of the observing system hardware and the assets. So that's the nuts and bolts of the network. And then taking those observations to produce data and data products, which are then used to address those issues. This colour code that I've used here refers to the diagram that I'm going to show on the next slide. Finally, we have the feedback which inform those societal themes, the big picture themes around climate, ocean health and ocean services. So that's the Goose part. Socat, that's the Surface Ocean Carbon Dioxide Atlas that Dorothee is going to talk about. And it's a collection of surface ocean CO2 observations. And that collection of observations is quality controlled by the science community itself, and then various data products produced. So here's that framework for ocean observing, a summary diagram. So here's the issues in orange that informs the design of the network in purple, and these observations are distributed over space and time, and that includes the deployment and maintenance of the platform as well. And then blue is that organisation of the data, adding value to the data to create products of use to a variety of users. And this is where Socat sits in this part of the framework. And then we've got that feedback component. So Socat takes the observations as a data and makes a data product of it, which can then feed back. So this strategic mapping tool also is a way of putting the various components of Goose into perspective. Using that same colour code, the requirements are the orange here, the observations in purple, and the data and the products shown in green on this slide, but have been in blue on the previous slides. So it runs through from the themes, through the societal benefits, applications, the phenomena that we're wishing to describe, the essential ocean variables, the things we need to measure to describe those phenomena via the platforms arranged into networks and the data networks. And this is where Socat sits, over here in this data networks. If you could follow back through this spaghetti of relationships, you would see that Socat leads right back through to all of these big three themes. Drilling down into the essential ocean variables, the one that we're interested in is the inorganic carbon one, which sits within the biogeochemistry suite of essential ocean variables, and it's shown in green, which means its readiness is mature, and it's managed by the biogeochemistry panel, which is part of the IOCCP, the International Ocean, Carbon and Biogeochemistry Coordination Project. Each of these essential ocean variables has a specification sheet, and this is something that Goose has been working on over the last few years, and I guess that you're probably familiar with this way of organising the EOVs and presenting them. So the one that we're interested in, this inorganic carbon one, has a number of sub-variables, one of which is PCO2, and that is the one that we're interested in today. There's also a number of supporting variables, several of which are of interest to PCO2 and Socat. Looking further down into that spec sheet for inorganic carbon, those three societal drivers are the ones that are driving the whole thing. And the phenomena that we're wishing to capture with the Socat product are the ones to do with the surface ocean. So that's air-sea fluxes, storage and inventory to a lesser extent, and ocean acidification, which is one of the consequences of the ocean taking up anthropogenic carbon. So it's these three phenomena which we're mainly looking at. And the networks that Socat calls upon to do this are the ship-based underway observations, which are dealing with surface data, the ship-based repeat hydrography, which have observations taken at the surface, so it's the surface data collected from that network. The moored fixed point observatories, several of them have PCO2 instruments at the surface, so they will also feed into Socat. Socat is currently grappling with data from these other observing networks, the drifters and the profiling floats. And a couple of issues around those. One is that Socat takes measured PCO2 data, and these profiling floats and some of the drifters tend to measure pH or other parameters and then deduce PCO2, so PCO2 is not directly measured. And the other thing that is a data management issue, and that these profiling floats produce a large amount of data, primarily giving vertical coverage, and so the horizontal data is only a small subset of that data. So it's a data management issue that Socat is looking at a way to manage. Even further down those pages of the spec sheets, and this is where Socat really comes into its own, is in this data and information creation. So Socat's involved here in the data quality control for the ship-based observations and the repeat hydrography, as a data repository, and finally as the data products production. So then we've got all this data and this data products. So how is that used and who's using it? So there's various applications, and Dorothee is going to go into some of these in a lot more detail in the next part of the presentation. But applications are publications, so there's numerous peer-reviewed science papers and reports, theses, both PhD theses and master theses. There's modelling studies and modelling evaluation. Socat's used for evaluating sensors such as the biogeochemistry Argo sensors. Used in the global climate budget, global carbon budget, sorry. So the most recent global carbon budget 2017 was published earlier this week. And then Socat's also used in science governance plans such as the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report, State of the Climate Reports, Go On, the Global Ocean Acidification Observing Network, governance plan, etc. So Dorothee is going to go into these in a lot more detail. So that's the applications of Socat. And then the final bit is the feedback, how these applications then feedback and inform those societal drivers, the big picture issues, and ultimately I guess that they refine the requirements of the observing system and the way we observe and what we observe, and that starts the whole loop again. So that's just a brief overview of how Socat fits into the goose picture and the goose kind of framework. And so now Dorothee is going to talk about Socat itself in a lot more detail. So over to you, Dorothee.
Thank you very much, Kim. So yes, it's a great pleasure to present Socat to you here tonight. So Socat, as Kim said, is the Surface Ocean CO2 Atlas. And this year we celebrate our 10th anniversary because we planned Socat, or started planning Socat, decided to create Socat in 2017 at an IOCCP SOLAS IMBER meeting, which was hosted by UNESCO, or at UNESCO, in the UNESCO building. I'll also talk about SOCOM, which is the Surface Ocean PCO2 mapping intercomparison, and these are both community activities and have more than 100 contributors worldwide. For Socat, I'd specifically like to mention the important role of our data managers, in particular the team at the University of Bergen, led by Benjamin Feil, and also the role of our data managers, our software developers, our software developers. This is a team led by Kevin O'Brien, and it's based at NOAA PMEL in the United States, in Seattle. So this is the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration in Seattle. But as you can see, Socat and SOCOM have many contributors, and some of these are listed here. We also have many funding agencies, and we have also many host organizations, and some of these are listed here. Next slide, please. So, first of all, earlier this week, the Global Carbon Project released the Global Carbon Budget. And what this slide shows is the global carbon budget for the past decade. It shows the sources of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So these are the emissions from using fossil fuels and from using or making cement. And these are the most important source of carbon dioxide, anthropogenic carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. But there also is a source from land use change. Now the right side of the slide shows the sinks for this carbon dioxide. What happens to it? Well, much of this carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere, and this leads to the growth of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and this leads to global warming. Then part of the carbon dioxide is taken up by the oceans. This is a sink of 20.5 petagrams of carbon per year. So this corresponds to 24% of the sink, or of the emissions. And in this talk, I'll refer to this ocean carbon sink as the anthropogenic CO2 taken up by the oceans with the symbol CN. And then finally, the land, so this is the plants on land and the soils on land, are also taking up carbon dioxide, and this is the land sink. However, yeah, so you can see here that the ocean carbon sink is really important because it takes away carbon from the atmosphere and therefore slows down the effects of climate change. But unfortunately, in taking up carbon dioxide, the oceans are also changing, and this is a process called ocean acidification, where the pH of the oceans is gradually decreasing very slowly, and also where the saturation state for calcium carbonate minerals is decreasing, and this has an effect on marine life. Next slide, please. What we do in our community is we make measurements of surface ocean carbon dioxide. So this is the FCO2, or the fugacity of carbon dioxide. It's the concentration of dissolved carbon dioxide divided by the solubility of the gas. And it's also equivalent to the partial pressure of carbon dioxide corrected for non-ideal behavior of the gas. And this is a very small correction. So in our community, people will either speak about FCO2, the fugacity, or PCO2, the partial pressure. So if we measure the fugacity of carbon dioxide in water and also in air, and we take the difference, then we can calculate the air sea flux for carbon dioxide. We also need to know the gas transfer, and we often use wind speed to calculate the gas transfer. So this is the net contemporary flux of carbon dioxide for the oceans. And if we then want to calculate the sink for anthropogenic carbon in the oceans, then we need to correct for the riverine outgassing, and then we get the CANT, the anthropogenic carbon sink. So we make measurements of FCO2 on research ships, as shown on the left. Increasingly, we are making measurements on drifting platforms or on moored platforms, such as that mooring shown there. And the figure on the right shows you the surface water FCO2 measurements that we have in Socat. So the black lines show the ship tracks, and the red points show the location of the moorings. Next slide, please. So as Kim said, in Socat we have surface ocean FCO2 measurements from moving and fixed platforms. So we do not have any calculated surface ocean FCO2 from calculated, for example, from pH, dissolved inorganic carbon, or alkalinity, and also we do not include any data from profiling instruments. We only have original FCO2 data in Socat, so these are data that come directly from the data originator, so we do not have any data that come from another data product. In Socat, we need sea surface temperature and salinity to calculate surface ocean FCO2, and we check these data. However, these checks do not quite meet the physical oceanographic quality checks for temperature and salinity that our physical oceanographic colleagues would like to do. So if you use these data, be very aware of that. So they're not quite as carefully checked as you might expect in a data set that's intended for temperature or salinity. Next slide, please. So this figure on the left shows you the data that we have in Socat. What is shown here is the fugacity of carbon dioxide with the colors indicating the height of the values. So this is our synthesis product. It has data for the global oceans, and all these data are in a uniform format, and we have carried out quality control. Then we also produce gridded products for surface ocean FCO2. So these are, for example, on a 1 degree latitude by 1 degree longitude scale, and on a monthly and annual basis. And we do not carry out any gap filling in these gridded products. And these products are all public, and we now have annual public releases. The figure on the right shows you the amount of data that we have per year in Socat. So what you can see is that we have some very old data, as old as 1957, but we have relatively few data per year in those early years. And then you can see that the amount of data goes up in the 1990s and still continues to increase during the present day. And then the different colors show you the successive releases that we've had of Socat. So in 2011 we released Socat version 1. Now we have Socat version 5. And what is also very striking is that thanks to the automation of our data upload, we now can release very recent data from the previous year in the next Socat version. So in Socat version 5 we have 21.5 million Surface Ocean FCO2 values, and these date from 1957 to 2011, and they have an accuracy of better than 5 microatmosphere. In addition to this, we have some calibrated sensor data, generally from moorings or drifters, and these have an accuracy of better than 10 microatmosphere. So everyone can access Socat with our online viewers. These are very powerful, and you can find them by going to our website, which is www.socat.info, and then click on the dataset viewer or the gridded viewer. And the figure on the top left was made with one of these online viewers. You can also download Socat in text format or NetCDF format, or you can use Ocean Data View. We have documented Socat in 4 Earth System Science data articles, so you can read the procedures that we followed to put Socat together. We have a fair data use statement, and as I said, Socat is a community activity with more than 100 contributors worldwide. Next slide, please. So this slide shows you the data distribution in Socat. The figure on the top left shows you the data before 1990, when data were still relatively sparse. And then you can see how the data availability increased from the 1990s to the 2000s to the current decade. You can also see that despite our enormous effort of colleagues worldwide to collect data, that there are also regions of the oceans where we still have very few data. For example, the Indian Ocean, the South Pacific Ocean, and also the large shelf areas of the Malaysian archipelago, and several other areas. Now, what these figures don't show very well is that in the high latitude, so in the polar oceans, that most of the data were collected in the summer months. So, for example, for the Arctic, we have either no or very few winter data, and the same applies to the Southern Ocean. Now, these figures all have very pretty colors, and they reflect the distribution of surface ocean FCO2. And for example, you can see these red colors in the tropical Pacific Ocean. And these reflect that there are lots of processes that affect FCO2 in the surface ocean, such as biology, ocean circulation, and other processes, and that the RC exchange is a relatively slow process relative to these other processes, so that surface ocean FCO2 tends to be out of equilibrium with atmospheric CO2. Next slide, please. So we have our annual releases, and we time these to release sometime in June, so that's on time for the preparations for the annual Global Carbon Budget, which this year was released in November, earlier this week. So if anyone is collecting data, please submit your data, your surface ocean FCO2 measurements to Socat, and then they will be uploaded for quality control. So the data submission for version 6 is closes on the 15th of January, but please submit your data earlier than that. Don't wait for the last day. And we aim to conclude our quality control for version 6 by the 31st of March. Also, if you're using Socat, then please provide feedback. User feedback is very important for us to improve the data product. Of course, we're working on the future as well. So now that we have automated the upload of data, we're also working on automating the upload of metadata, and we aim to have this complete in time for version 7. We're also already saving other parameters, surface ocean parameters that are submitted together with surface ocean FCO2 data, such as, for example, nutrients and dissolved inorganic carbon and alkalinity. And we are going to release these data, but we are not going to carry out any quality control on these data. So we'll release them in a separate product, And of course, any volunteers for carrying out this quality control, we would like to hear from you, and we'd like to collaborate with you. We are discussing a possible parallel product for surface ocean methane and nitrous oxide, two other important greenhouse gases, and we're discussing the possible inclusion of atmospheric CO2 in Socat itself. Next slide, please. So, as Kim already mentioned, Socat has diverse applications, and this is a somewhat older slide now. So, the colors show the different applications of Socat. So, the red bars show studies where Socat is used for quantifying the ocean carbon sink. The orange color shows where Socat is used for quantifying ocean acidification, and the green color is where Socat is used for model evaluation. Next slide. Please continue. And earlier this year, we made a voluntary commitment to the 2017 UN Ocean Conference to continue the annual public releases of the Surface Ocean CO2 Atlas. Next slide. So just very briefly, Socat is used for model evaluation, and these kind of studies tend to find that the models underestimate the variability in surface ocean PCO2. Next slide, please. Socat has been used to quantify the coastal ocean carbon sink, and estimates range from a sink of 0.2 to 0.4 petagrams of carbon per year. Next slide, please. Socat, as a very important application of Socat, is to quantify the ocean carbon sink by mapping surface ocean FCO2 or PCO2, and the method is shown here. So you start with a Socat synthesis product, then you try to fill in the gaps by using some kind of interpolation method. This can be a statistical method or some kind of model or a neural network. So then you end up with lovely maps of the distribution of surface ocean PCO2, for example, on a monthly scale on a 1 degree latitude by 1 degree longitude scale grid. And if you combine this with wind speed and a gas transfer parameterization, then you can calculate the CO2 air-sea flux. And if you then apply a correction for riverine carbon outgassing, then you get the ocean carbon sink for anthropogenic CO2. Next slide, please. So here are the examples of 4 of such mapping products. So this shows the distribution of surface ocean FCO2 for a decade, 2000 to 2009. You can see that there are differences between the 4 maps, quite considerable differences. So this highlights the different forcings and also approaches that these methods use. And also you can see that several of these methods exclude the Arctic Ocean and coastal seas. And also other methods treat the coastal seas as if it were an open ocean. So this is still, there's still space for improvement here. Next slide, please. SOCOM is the surface ocean PCO2 mapping intercomparison, and in SOCOM these mapping methods are compared, and many of these mapping methods use Socat. These methods are very, very different in their forcing and their driver data sets. SOCOM welcomes new methods, and if anyone is interested in participating in SOCOM, then contact Christian Reudenbeck, who is at the Max Planck Institute in Jena, or go to the SOCOM website. Next slide, please. So this shows a part of the SOCOM intercomparison. It shows the ocean carbon sink according to 10 of these mapping methods. You can see that there are considerable differences between the mapping methods. You can also see that there's quite a bit of variability in the ocean carbon sink, both on year-to-year basis and on a decadal basis. The ocean carbon sink seemed to be relatively constant before the year 2000, and then to increase from 2000 to about 2011. If we were to compare this to an ocean carbon model, then models would underestimate this variation. And I also should say that if we map ocean carbon for the oceans, that this provides priors for atmospheric inversion. So this then enables quantification of the land carbon sink in atmospheric inversions. Next slide, please. So this is another example of these estimates of the, in this case, the Southern Ocean carbon sink. So the blue line and the orange line show the Southern Ocean carbon sink according to two mapping methods. Both these methods indicate an increase in the Southern Ocean carbon sink after about 2011. There's also a thin black line that results from an atmospheric inversion, and it also shows an increase in the Southern Ocean carbon sink after about 2011. And then finally we can compare this to a model. That's the thick black line. So this thick black line shows a steady increase in the Southern Ocean carbon sink, but it does not show all this variability that the mapping methods and the atmospheric inversion seem to suggest. Next slide, please. So these mapping methods are now also used in the global carbon budget to estimate the ocean carbon sink. So the figure on the left shows in the black the estimate of the ocean carbon sink in the most recent global carbon budget, and the lines in yellow, in orange and in pink show estimates of the ocean carbon sink from two of the mapping methods. And the blue lines are the results of models that are anchored on an ocean carbon sink of 2.2 petagrams of carbon per year in the 1990 decade. So to date, the global carbon budget uses the models to quantify the size of the ocean carbon sink, but it's increasingly looking at these ocean carbon sink from the mapping methods to look at the variability in the ocean carbon sink. Next slide, please. So to work toward the conclusion, surface ocean carbon observations can be used for quantifying the ocean carbon sink, and in particular the variation, the trends and the processes in the ocean carbon sink. It can be used for quantifying the land carbon sink by providing priors for atmospheric inversion, and it can be used for evaluation of ocean carbon models, and this will feed into the IPCC report ultimately. Findings from surface ocean carbon observations and their synthesis are that there is year-to-year and decadal variation in the ocean carbon sink, and that models underestimate this variation. However, there are lots of challenges. We have short data records. There are many regions with very few data. There is an uncertainty in the mapping that we are still trying to understand better. This riverine carbon outgassing is a very large term with a large uncertainty, and we'd like to quantify this better. We'd like to quantify the coastal ocean carbon sink better, as well as the Arctic ocean carbon sink. And we do not understand the role of sea ice very well, but this is a relatively small term in our budgets. And of course, we also need to improve our gas transfer parameterizations and the wind speed products. Next slide, please. So to conclude, Socat has its 10th anniversary this year, and we're now on version 5. Socat has many contributors and many funding agencies, so I'd like to invite all of you to contribute to and or use these products, acknowledge the contribution of the data providers, for example by invitation to co-authorship, notably in regional studies, and please ensure to cite relevant scientific publications by the data providers. For version 6, the data submission will close on the 15th of January, and quality control should be complete by the 31st of March. User feedback is essential, and of course we need sustained funding for data collection and data synthesis. So I'd like to thank you all to listening to Kim and me, and in particular I'd like to thank all the enthusiastic contributors to Socat and SOCOM. Thank you.
And thank you to Dorothee, and thank you to Kim for the presentation. It was really great to see at the beginning, Kim, the use of the framework for ocean observing to place Socat in its place in Goose, and it's great to be able to feature some of the great products that can come out of the observing system here. The audience, thank you for joining us, and now is time for your questions, and you can ask questions in the chat window or in the questions window. If you have trouble finding them, just look for the little triangle by the chat and send your question to the entire audience, so everybody can see it, and that way somebody can actually answer questions from the audience as well. So we have a first question from Li-Ching Zhang. PCO2 shows large seasonal and interannual changes. Have you done any such corrections on your PCO2 products to get to the mapping? Dorothee or Kim, do you want to answer that question?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I fully understand the question. So first we create Socat, and there we treat all the data in the same way. We have documented this in our articles how we do this. So we try to be we try to be very, very consistent in this. And then the mapping products, when they start with Socat, they will use, for example, a neural network that looks at relationships between surface ocean CO2 and, for example, temperature or chlorophyll and other parameters, and they will then try to create a map out of the surface ocean CO2 data. And other mapping methods do this in a different way, but many of these mapping methods look at relationships between surface ocean CO2 and other parameters that have a better data coverage, and then create the map. So I wouldn't call this corrections, but of course these mapping methods have a lot of assumptions inherent to the method, and these assumptions will differ between the different methods. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, so there's probably a seasonal bias in some of the observations, just because the ship-based observations that you're taking are maybe biased towards the summer season in each hemisphere. Is that correct?
There certainly is a seasonal bias in the data collection, especially for the high latitude oceans. So so many of the mapping methods struggle, or basically it's also, if there's no data, it's also very difficult to assess even the uncertainty in a mapping product. So where data coverage is good, these mapping methods can estimate an uncertainty, and both for summer and for winter. But this becomes more, so there's a seasonal bias in as far as that the data coverage is much better in the summer, yes.
So each mapping product will make some estimate of the error, I suppose, but in the Socat product itself, do you have an estimate of the representativity of the amount of data that's in the product in order to be able to actually capture the variability that's happening in CO2?
In the synthesis products, we do not have such. Well, we have the quality flag, but that's only an accuracy of the data flag. And I guess the user can look at the data availability in a specific region himself or herself. In the gridded product, we do indicate the number of data points that goes into the mean per grid point. And we also indicate the standard deviation.
Okay.
So, yeah.
We have a question from Jens Muller, which is, based on which observations or data do you calculate the riverine outgassing? And I think that's a question about the full CO2 budget, perhaps released by the Global Carbon Project.
The riverine outgassing, it's based on a study by Andy Jacobson in, oh gosh, I'm now struggling to remember the year. I think it's 2007, but I may be wrong. And it's better to look up that paper to check what that estimate is based on. Yeah. So
I have a question about the connection to the observing data. So obviously, it's amazing that you've gotten more than 100 contributors to deliver data to the product. Do you have a sense? Do you know that whether all available observations have been submitted? Is there tracking of all CO2 underway measurements, for example, for you to be able to follow up and see whether you're actually well, there's some more data that you could considerably chase?
Well, we certainly don't have all the data that is available. We very much try to have a carrot approach in which we encourage people to participate in Socat and to also benefit from it, from the collaborations that this creates. But no, we are aware that there are more data that exist. We don't have a full overview of how many data we're missing, but we definitely are missing data. Yeah. But we focus on putting together Socat, and if people want to join us, they're very, very welcome.
I think one of the issues too is the historical data that people are pretty good about submitting their current data, but going back and getting historical data in the required sort of format, we're probably missing a bit there.
And then I have another question before I get back to some of the online questions about the mix of observations that goes into Socat. So you show that there's underway data, there's some fixed point data from moorings and perhaps from ship-based observatories as well. Do you have a sense of what the influence of each of these observation types is in doing the mapping products and making the estimates? And is there a way to estimate based on the error characteristics from different observing types, what is constraining the mapping products most in terms of type of observation?
Well, first of all, the mapping products make different assumptions on which data they actually use. I know that one of the mapping products does not include the mooring data, so it only uses the ship data. I think there's very few stationary ships. I think virtually all of our ships are moving around, with possible exception of one or two, so that's not a large group. No, I don't quite know how the presence of a ship versus a mooring affects the error estimates in the various mapping products, and that's something that the mapping colleagues could look into. We're still very much at the beginning, I think, of the mapping products. There's a lot of progress to be made there, and of course, with hindsight, we'll learn how good the mapping products were for, say, the current decade, or for 2-3 years ago. If we move into the future, once it's 2020, we can look back at the mapping estimates for 2017 and see how good they were.
So in your talk, you showed a lot of global scale maps, but you did show a few estimates of the coastal fluxes of CO2. And we have a couple of questions actually about very specifically how much data is available in the Gulf of Guinea region, but also how can we, more generally from Nisikak Benson, how can we quantify the coastal ocean carbon sinks? Is there enough data to actually regionally quantify the coastal ocean carbon sinks?
First, on the question of the Gulf of Guinea, I think my guess would be that there's relatively few data in the Gulf of Guinea. At least I think this is near Africa, and if that's the case, then I think there's very few data there. But however, the questioner can investigate this himself or herself by going to our Socat website and then go to the cruise data viewer, and there you can zoom in to any region of the oceans and investigate this yourself. It's relatively straightforward, and one can also zoom in to a specific year or to a specific ship or to a specific season. So these are questions that people who plan a cruise can look up before they go to sea, for example. Then we actually, on the second question, we have a lot of data in the coastal oceans. And this is partly because all these open ocean ships also sail through the coastal oceans or the coastal seas before they get to the open ocean. So actually there is relatively high data coverage in the coastal oceans, except for the regions where I said that we have very few data, such as the Malaysian archipelago. However, in the variability of surface ocean FCO2 is also very high in the coastal oceans, which makes it which gives its own challenges in, for example, using mapping products for the coastal oceans. And there is now one study, which is also a very recent study, using a mapping product for estimating the CO2 sink in the coastal oceans.
So we seem to have lost my camera, but I am still here.
Oh, good.
I just have a question because, again, probing a little more about the coastal ocean. There is growing interest at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change under the Paris Agreement about treating ocean issues holistically and about looking into blue carbon, sort of accounting of carbon uptake in coastal waters, in very nearshore coastal waters, but more broadly in the EEZ of a country. Can your mapping products, and maybe this is a question more for your mapping colleagues, but can your mapping products give us a sense of what density of observations we'd need in the coastal ocean in order to actually, with some reliability, estimate changes in the uptake of CO2 in the coastal ocean?
Well, in a way, estimating the data that are necessary for coming with reliable products is quite a field on its own in some way. So at the moment, the focus of most of our colleagues is on actually trying to quantify the sink in either the open ocean or in the coastal ocean or in both with as accurately as possible, and trying to come up with an error estimate also for uncertainty estimate for their estimate of the sink in that specific region. Now then, estimating how many data are needed for quantifying the sink accurately is an additional question, and I'm not sure how many colleagues have looked at this.
Have they looked at it at a global scale? I mean, one of the big interests of looking at the CO2 fluxes with the global ocean is to understand, try to understand whether the capacity of the ocean to absorb CO2 will be limited and reduce in the future, as model projections suggest.
Well, there are some studies that are looking at this for the open oceans, but again, this is also a field which is still kind of in development, and I guess also it might depend on the mapping product, how many observations you really need to come up with an accurate estimate of the ocean carbon sink, and we're still trying to compare these mapping products and trying to work out why some products seem to do better at estimating the sink in region where we have data than other products, and it's very interesting that it's not necessarily one type of mapping product that seems to do better than the others. It might more be with the skill that the mapping product has been applied with that is important for quantifying the ocean carbon sink.
Okay, I have a couple questions then about your users of the Socat database, and you seem to track. You showed a graph of showing what types of users you have. I'm quite interested in how you interact with those users and how you track, in fact, who's using your data. And for example, do you have a regular way of citing the Socat data, DOI, in scientific papers?
Well, first of all, our we'd like people to cite our ESSD articles, because we have multi-author ESSD articles where we put all the contributors for a specific version as an author. So we'd really like people to use these ESSD articles, because that gives credit to the data providers and the contributors. We also have DOI numbers for the Socat products themselves. And we do not have a smart way, I'd say, of tracking the users, but we can go to the to look at who is citing us. We can use the Web of Science for that, and Google and other tools. Yeah, and we can also we are tracking who is visiting our website.
Is there a way for them to give you feedback on how they interact and how they access Socat data?
Well, people can write to us, and a lot of people do that. And some of the errors are found by feedback from users, and that's, you know, so that's very important for us. For a while, we've stopped this now. We had an early release to users to hopefully find problems and report them back so we could correct them in the main release. We no longer have that early release, but we very much like the feedback from users. And yeah.
One of the important users in terms of a public face that you showed is the Global Carbon Project, and they use the data to make yearly estimates of the carbon budget. Do you work with them directly on that, or is that something what's the relationship between Socat and the Global Carbon Project?
Yes, there is a very strong collaboration between Socat and the Global Carbon Project. At the moment, the two mapping products in the Global Carbon Project use Socat, and they're very strong collaborators with Socat. And also, the Global Carbon Budget produces an Earth System Science data article every year when it comes with its release. And on there, it includes the data providers for the land, the ocean, and the atmosphere as co-authors. So we have a very strong collaboration with the Global Carbon Project. And it's very important for our community that that link exists.
Yeah. Well, and I think it does have a lot of public impact. There's often articles and citations of the annual report of the Global Carbon Project on the trend in the global carbon budget. It's of quite a lot of interest, and I think they probably time the releases to the COPs of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change for maximum impact. Coming back to the relationship between Socat and the observing system, you showed areas where there's undersampling of the ocean, where there isn't enough sampling, and that impacts what you're able to say about the carbon fluxes in particular regions. Have you ever done any sort of experiments about trying to see what the sampling is needed, what level of space and time sampling would be necessary to make a significant change in the error characteristics of the products that you can generate out of Socat?
Socat itself hasn't done this, and as you can see, Socat is primarily putting these data together and then collaborates with users to get the maximum impact. And so it's also partly up to the users to do those kind of studies on what sampling is needed. And there Socat collaborates with the IOCCP and research projects.
And the IOCCP, which also serves as the Goose biogeochemistry panels, is a very important interface between the data products and the data assembly efforts like Socat and Goose. Is that a sufficient entry point into Goose? Would you like more interaction with the observing networks that you're collecting data from?
Oh, I don't know for sure. I mean, the most important for us is, I guess, that the data collection has sustained funding, and that there is also funding for putting together Socat, and that funding is a real struggle. So, I mean, many countries, the funding also for Socat is a problem. So, I don't know I mean, IOCCP is doing a fantastic job, and I'm not sure if a better link to Goose would necessarily improves Socat per se. Maybe, but we're very, very happy with IOCCP.
Okay.
I mean, our community is really, is one of the organizations that works for our community.
Yeah. So let me probe a little bit more about the funding and how you've organized yourself. So you have a lot of contributors, and the work of assembling the data and the quality control of the data is the work of a smaller group. I mean, how do you organize that? Are you a completely volunteer group of putting Socat together? What are the different funding sources? How have they been assembled and cobbled together in the past year?
Well, I mean, of course, everyone has a job or a PhD position or a postdoc position in generally marine carbon cycling, marine carbon studies. But yes, people in a way are volunteers. They volunteer to spend their time on Socat, and many of them work very long days or hours to be able to fit this in with their normal job. The funding is organized at a local or regional level, so individual data providers have funding for running their doing the measurements on their ship and for making their contribution to Socat. In some cases this might be on a national level, say in the United States it might be more on a rather big national level, but in a way the colleagues in the different countries organize their own funding. Yeah. And of course I can comment best on Europe. I don't know how things are organized in, say, Australia or New Zealand, but everyone organizes this themselves, and everyone is very enthusiastic, and the community finds Socat very, very important, and that's why people put time into it.
Kim, do you want to comment from your perspective? Yeah.
Yes, just from my perspective. So I'm a data contributor, so I consider that just part of kind of good practice, really, in supporting the international community, is that I submit the data from our underway vessel, the PCO2 system that's on our research vessel. I submit data to Socat, and I'm also a QCer, so I'm involved in the quality control annual effort. So we're organised into groups, into regional groups. So I'm part of the Southern Ocean group, and again, that's voluntary, but for me, I consider that an important part of the process. Socat's a really valuable product, and so it's volunteer time, I guess. Some is my own time, and some is funded through work. So NIWA pays ultimately, I guess. But I guess we also get there's funded positions, the data managers, for example, and also we have quite a lot of, we have some funding for meetings. So on the slide that you can see, there's various meetings that we've had where the community gets together to look at particular areas or particular issues, data management, automation, whatever it's going to be, and that's funded through various ways and is often tacked onto another science meeting.
Yeah, I can comment the funded positions for the data managers. For example, part of the data managers are currently using Norwegian funding. It's Norwegian ICOS funding, so that's an observing system. The software developers in the United States are on, I'm not entirely sure what funding source, but these people are very, very key to the project, and it's great that, you know, they can spend an enormous amount of time on it, because they do spend a lot of time on making this happen.
So as you mentioned, nearly everyone that works on Socat is sitting in an academic system. Not everyone, because Kim, you're sitting in a more operational agency, but that's true of much of Goose, much of the observing system, both on the observation side and on the data management side, is that it's grown out of scientific activity, and that scientific activity has been sustained. And there is worry in some places about the sustainability of that, because science likes innovation, science likes to answer new questions. So now that you're 10 years old, is it easier or harder to get funding because you've been doing the activity for 10 years, so scientific funders might want to do something new? On the other hand, you've been able to prove value over the past 10 years. So I'm just curious about which way you think the funding is going in terms of sustaining the activity.
Well, I'm not sure if there's general trends. I can comment on Europe. Our funding has been really problematic since about 5 years. And this is really hampering the Socat efforts. Before that, there were two very important European grants, Carbo Ocean and Carbo Change, that basically allowed us to create both Socat and GLODAP, which is another important product in our community. And now these two products, at least as far as the scientists are concerned, are much more running on a shoestring and have become much more volunteer, and people find it really important, and therefore they do it. But at the moment, very few people actually have funding to spend time on Socat and similar products. So this is an issue. I don't think it has to do with the funders wanting to do something new, but they did want to fund different things. Yeah, more social science, more directly applied to the community, and you know, the slightly more hardcore oceanography is struggling to find funding in that climate.
Yeah, so that's something really perhaps important to highlight with governments, and something we could try to do through the IC. One last question, which is, as you mentioned, and you have papers with many authors, you've had more than 100 scientists participating. Is it getting easier to get people to share their data? Was that a cultural change that was difficult at the beginning of Socat, and what was the key to that cultural change in data sharing?
I think, well, first of all, I should also mention CDIAC, the Carbon Dioxide Information Center, which has been the data center for our community for many years. It's now been incorporated into a NOAA data center called NCI, the National Center for Environmental Information. But the fact that we had such a data center where many of us for decades contributed our data to has been very key in then also having the willingness to create data products such as Socat and GLODAP. So already in 2007, when we envisioned Socat, we thought there was a need for such a product, and already the community in a way was willing to share the data. And of course we are growing. We have new data providers, so we hope that the wide use of Socat convinces I don't know, maybe slightly more doubting data providers that it's a good thing to join us, and that actually having their data in Socat can also be useful for them. Because many of the studies that use Socat are actually by Socat contributors. Not, you know, some of them are by other people, but a lot of the Socat contributors also use Socat for accessing the data in their favorite region.
Right, and you can do a lot more with the full data set than you can with your own single data set. Tim, I saw you smile when I asked that question. Do you want to add anything?
No, not particularly. I think that the value of adding, of contributing to Socat becomes obvious, I think, and that even though it's time consuming often to get the data in a format and then to participate in the QC process if you want to do that part of it, the benefits are enormous. And so as people begin to participate in the system, then I think then they're willing to do so more and more.
Okay, thank you very much, and we've run out of time. So thank you very much, Dorothee, and thank you, Kim, for your presentation. Thank you for the audience for sticking with us and asking questions. And our next Goose webinar will be on the 6th of December, so in about 3 weeks' time, on IGMETS on Marine Ecological Time Series by Laura Lorenzoni. Thank you very much. Have a good day and good evening to those of you, depending on your time zones. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.